Good afternoon and welcome to the Value of OEM Certification for MSOs webinar sponsored by PPG. I'm Krista McNamara, Managing Editor of ABRN Magazine, and I'll be your moderator today. OEM certification requirements can be demanding in terms of equipment and training. However, the certification process can represent a nice income source in the right environment. Today we have with us Darrell Amberson, Director of MSO Relations with ABRN and VP of Operations with LaMettry's Collision, and Mike Anderson, owner of CollisionAdvice.com, a training and consulting firm, and he's also an ABRN columnist. Darrell and Mike are going to discuss the ins and outs of OEM certification for MSOs, helping you to evaluate this strategy as part of your overall business. Again, we'd like to thank our sponsor, PPG, for their support in bringing you this information. To kick off our presentation and to give Darrell and Mike a little bit of an idea of where the audience stands on OEM certification, we'd like to start first with a polling question about your current OEM certification involvement. You can respond to the question by clicking right on your screen. So the question is, are you currently part of any OEM certification programs, and if so, how many? And the responses are, no, I am not part of any OEM certification programs, yes with one OEM, yes with 2 to 4 OEMs, yes with 5 or more OEMs. Again, that's no, I'm not part of any, yes with 1, yes with 2 to 4, yes with 5 or more. Okay, so it looks like about 66% of our audience today are not part of any OEM certification programs. So, we really hope to give you a lot of information to help you make your mind up on this. So Darrell and Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Krista. What we want to make with this is that OEM certification differentiates your business from the competition. I won't go through reading these line by line. You can read them for yourself. But really what we want to discuss here are some of the pros and cons and some of the ways to go about looking at OEM certification for your business. In other words, how do you first approach it? What do you consider? What are the aspects? What are the costs? Things like that. So we're going to be getting into all of those points.
And now that Darrell's given you a little bit of the highlights about what we hope to talk today, let's drill down even further. We have one more poll question for you. Please indicate which area of the industry you are in. Are you an insurer, information provider, paint company, repairer, OEM, or dealership? Again, those answers are insurer, information provider, paint company, repairer, OEM, or dealership. And just something to keep in mind as the presentation goes forward, if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll be tackling those at the end. Okay, so it looks like about 60% of our attendees today are repairers. Okay, so Darrell and Mike, now that we know a little bit more about our audience, can you give us some insight on where to start with these certification processes?
Absolutely. There's several ways to go about it. Of course, you can go to some industry events. For example, if you attend SEMA, CIC, you might be able to find some manufacturer representatives. That might be a good source for you to get started. But frankly, the most typical way of going about it is to have a dealership relationship, talk to the dealership about any OEM certifications that their manufacturer may offer, and start from there. Oftentimes they can contact the appropriate factory representatives, get the appropriate documentation, guidelines, things like that, and really that's the place where you start in terms of your consideration of your decision. Mike,
Darrell, one other thing I'd like to add is I think that when you start to research this as well, that you really need to determine what is your market area, the demographics like in your area. For example, if you're in a very rural area, it may not make sense for you to pursue an Audi certification or a Volkswagen certification. So the first thing I would do is if I had a management system, I'd go back and look over a 5-year period and see if I could extrapolate data as to what were the top 5 types of vehicles that I fixed. Was it Toyota? Was it Volkswagen? Was it Ford? What may the case be? A lot of times your paint companies will also be able to provide you some type of demographics report that shows you what the vehicle count or population is in your local area, and that may also help guide you a little bit or lead you down the road to which OEMs you may want to pursue.
Great points, Mike. And when you bring up paint companies as well, there are some other entities that do some of the certification, as we're going to see later in the presentation. That can also be a starting point as well. You might talk with them about any certifications that they may be aware of. And like Mike said, it makes a lot of sense to check your demographics and find out what's really worth pursuing in your area.
Great points.
Darrell, you mentioned a little bit of information on the dealer's perspective, but there's also a lot to consider from an MSO perspective. Well, actually, I'm sorry. Going back, can you tell us a little bit more about the dealership's perspective and what their main goals are in having a certification program?
Well, of course, we did some research on this before starting out, and we got some pretty valuable information here, I think, from Nissan and Infiniti. Some of the statements here, in fact, I'll read this one. When they talk about their certification plan, they described it, the purpose of it is this: expand the collision parts activities to further enhance vehicle ownership experience, collision parts sales, and profits through the launch of certified collision repair network for collision shops. I think that says a lot right there and why they're going about it. And these statistics underneath it we found is very compelling. It's amazing that 60% of people repairing a vehicle in a collision will trade out of that vehicle within 12 months, and also 60% of vehicle owners will change brands after a total loss. So the point here is that it makes a lot of sense for a dealership to engage in a certification with an independent repairer so that they can gain the kind of relationship where they can stay close to those customers as they contemplate those kind of changes, that they position themselves for the opportunity to perhaps to sell them another car or just at least maintain them as a customer.
Two other points I'd like to add to that, Darrell. I can give you an example. Like with the new Corvette certification, if the dealership on some of the new Corvettes, if a dealership does not have a certified shop or a certified technician that they have access to, they actually are not even allowed by General Motors to actually sell that specific Corvette. So sometimes it could cause a restriction in sales for a dealership if they don't have a certified shop. The second thing a dealership would have value in and having a shop or sponsoring a shop is if you look at some of the aluminum programs, for example, the certified aluminum program for Audi, for Jag, or for Mercedes, if a shop's not certified, they cannot actually even purchase the parts for those vehicles on structural parts. So the thing is, if you had a dealership and they had to have that car sent somewhere else, they're also losing out on the parts sales. So it behooves them to have somebody in their local market area that's certified, so they may not lose out on those parts sales because the car has to go to a certified shop that may be out of their market area where they actually solicit or sell business to.
Great points, Mike, and really good points that a repairer could utilize in terms of going to the dealership, enhancing the relationship, and discussing the certification, and why the dealership should partner up with a shop. Having that kind of information is valuable.
You've given us a lot of information on some of the things that the dealers consider and the benefits for them, but there's also a lot that the MSOs really need to focus on. First and foremost, the equipment that they have in their shop. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, let's just say you've made it through the first step, and that the dealership says, yes, we have a certification program, and provides you with some information in terms of the requirements. One of the first things that you're going to be seeing is that what are equipment requirements they have. And of course, they'll vary a lot from one manufacturer to another, but some can be very extensive. You can see by the photograph here, there's a vehicle on a rack with some dedicated fixtures on it. And some certification programs require that type of equipment to repair their vehicles, as well as all the other items listed here, including welding equipment, hand tools, and things like aluminum stalls, clean rooms, things like that. Mike, you could probably add a lot to that as well. You've gone through this before.
Yes, absolutely correct. And one of the things I want to be cautious for everybody about, or just I guess a statement of warning, is I believe that probably the majority of people in this car are very legit in their business operations. There have been instances that I'm aware of because I'm affiliated with some of the OEM certification programs where a shop might try to kind of act like they have a welder or something that actually belongs to a friend of theirs' shop. But some of the programs, like for example Chrysler, they're very, very disciplined. They actually want a picture of the welder, a picture of the plug, show that it's plugged into the wall. I mean, they really want proof. Unlike, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but in some insurance cases, they survey you and do you have a computerized measuring system? Do you have this? Do you have that? But there's really no validation program for an insurer to verify that a shop actually has the equipment. If they say they do, they just take them at their word. With a lot of your equipment considerations for your OEM for your OEM relationships, they're actually going to go in and validate that. So just kind of a word of warning. I'm not saying that anyone on this call would do that, but you really can't try to pull that by somebody. Somebody's going to come in there and validate it. I also think you need to look at, especially if you're looking at your aluminum programs versus like a Nissan or Infiniti, where it's just kind of an overall program. It's not specifically geared towards aluminum like the Audi program would be or Mercedes. You really have to kind of weigh the return on investment. So I would encourage anybody that considers it to really make sure that if you're not familiar with numbers, get somebody again, whether it's a consultant, somebody from your paint company or your CPA, to really help you to understand what that return on investment would be. How many cars you're going to have to fix to get back the money you're going to invest in that. Because some of the equipment considerations can be anywhere from $20,000 and upwards to some of the OEM programs are closer to $300,000 in equipment, depending on the type of frame machine you may have to purchase or spot water.
Good. Thank you, Mike. Krista, can we go to the next slide?
Sure. So obviously there's a lot to consider in terms of the equipment that you have, but there's also a lot to think about in terms of some of the training that MSO techs might have to go through to gain these OEM certifications, and even more importantly, the cost of these training. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, and again, they vary a lot from one manufacturer to another, but some can frankly get quite extensive. As you can see by the list here, even some requiring not only paint and body technicians to receive certain levels of education, but also estimators, advisors, shop management, and of course all the different aspects of it. And as you contemplate the cost, take all the costs into consideration as well, because some require some extensive travel. I know, Mike, I remember talking to you when you were involved with, wasn't it the Audi program where you sent some technicians to Germany?
Yeah, that's correct. When we first became an Audi certified shop, that was back when you actually had to send technicians to Germany to get trained, and you had to have at least 2 technicians certified at all times. They then eventually moved the training to the Appleton iCar Training Center in Appleton, Wisconsin, and when we initially, kind of the second phase of that for aluminum structural, it was $32,000 per technician to get them certified, and that was a 2-week training course. So again, you have your loss of production, you have travel, you have, their air expense, et cetera, and then they have to be recertified. And then again, you always have that where that technician may leave. A lot of times people ask me, Mike, if I take and I invest a lot of money into getting a technician certified through one of the programs like Audi or Mercedes or Jag or whatever the case may be, what do I do if they ever leave? I will tell you what I did, and that was we actually had almost like an employment, I wouldn't say agreement, that just said that if somebody worked for us and they left within a certain amount of time, that they would be possibly responsible to reimburse us for any training costs within 6 months or a year from the time of that training. Again, I think that could vary state by state, so you'd want to check with your attorney on that. But the other thing that I think I would really point out to everybody, again, is make sure that if you do send somebody to training, that it's somebody that you have a good relationship with, not somebody that's maybe new. If you have a manager or maybe even as an owner, you might even consider going yourself, even if you're not actually fixing the vehicle, just so you can always maintain that certification. And again, you really know what's going on, so you can keep your employees up to date with that as well.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Mike, you were just involved, would you say yesterday? I know from LaMettry's we've sent some people to some Porsche training that's taking place right now in California. How many days does that take for that training, and how extensive is it, Mike?
Okay, so for example, to become a Porsche certified facility, you actually have to take the damage analysis class that I teach on behalf of Axalta Coatings, formerly known as DuPont Performance Services. So yesterday I conducted a class in Fairfield, California, and there were 7 people that were in that class that were there specifically for Porsche certification. I can kind of give you a rundown a little bit on some of the cost of training and what's available out there for people. I can tell you Toyota has a very affordable training. They have a couple training centers throughout the United States. You cannot be a certified Toyota facility unless you're actually owned by a dealership. However, you can have factory-trained technicians. For example, I sent my technicians to the New Jersey training centers. There's a gentleman there by the name of James Myers who's very, very knowledgeable. Toyota, Lexus, and Scion training was typically anywhere from $200 to $400 a day, and the training classes were anywhere from 1 to 3 days. And as long as you had a local dealership that would sponsor you, you could send your attendees. But again, you cannot be a certified Toyota facility unless you're owned by a dealership. BMW, their training was free. All you had to do was pay the travel cost of your employees, and you actually had to have a dealership sponsor you, and a dealership could sponsor multiple body shops. Again, with BMW, you could not be a certified BMW facility unless you were owned by a dealership, but again, you could have factory-trained technicians. So it's really, you've got to be really careful about what type of wording you use in your advertising, just so you don't get on the bad side of an OEM. The Audi certification program, they actually certified facilities, unlike BMW or Toyota, and there was a big investment in equipment. There was also a very big investment in training. And again, depending on whether you were going for steel certification or aluminum, and depending on what type of equipment you already had, your training cost or equipment cost could be anywhere from $30,000 upwards to $400,000. Back to some other training. Last I've been told is like credit certification can actually be accomplished through Assured Performance. That's Scott Biggs and his organization. I do know that Farzan with Verifax was doing some of the certification processes for Ford. And then with Honda, there was a certification process there, and they actually utilized somebody from Axalta Coatings to actually come in and do the certification to ensure you met all the compliance. Nissan Infiniti, they also have a certification program as well, and you become a certified facility. I have found that they are very strong in regards to some of the marketing materials that they provide to their shops. And again, that's a pretty affordable program. Most of these programs do have some type of iCar training that you do have to take, unless it's like Audi, Volkswagen, or Porsche, and they just recently built a new training center in Herndon, Virginia. Mercedes-Benz, they have a certification program as well, and again, you have to be sponsored by a dealership, and they actually use Summit Consulting to actually go in and certify the shops for that. And then Jag also has a certification program. So it's kind of unique because a lot of people used to think that the only people that had certification programs were the high-end European manufacturers, but we're now seeing the Asian manufacturers with Nissan, Infiniti, Honda, Acura, and now even the domestic manufacturers such as Chrysler and Ford also coming out with certification programs. So it really depends on what your budget is, what you're willing to spend for the certification, but you have to also look at if you're going to have to spend a lot of money on equipment, are you going to fix enough of those cars to recoup your investment? There is one other point that I would probably bring out, and that is some people look at the return on investment or ROI, but I do know some shops that they look at as an ROO, return on objective, that they may not necessarily feel they're going to get that much money back to make off of there. They're just doing it to kind of protect their niche or protect that market area or to provide service to a specific DRP account or a dealership account.
Thank you, Mike. Krista, can we go to the next slide?
So obviously, there's a lot of costs to contemplate here, and in addition to that, our certification fees. What can MSOs inspect in this vein?
Great point. Here's another cost to this that needs to be taken into consideration. And as we received information to look at these various OE programs, we're not going to get into the position of comparing one to another, but we did see some fees getting up there to a pretty significant amount. As you can see, some range as high as $13,500 just for the certification fee. And then, of course, there's recertification fees that come up that might be 1 or 2 years after the original certification. In other words, to a fee to keep you to maintain your certification. And some programs require additional technician fees as well. So in other words, they only cover one technician in that original fee, and any additional one comes with more money. As you can see, they can range up as high as $8,500 per additional technician.
Darrell, one other thing I'd like to point out too is one of the kind of the attitudes I took towards OEM certifications was a lot of people look at it as an investment. And they're like, you know what, I'm never going to fix any Audis, or I'm not going to fix any BMWs, or I'm not going to fix any Chryslers or Corvettes. But it's also, I kind of look at it like buying business insurance. If buying business insurance, you pay that amount every year, and you could be paying out anywhere from $7,000 to $30,000 depending on the size of your business for business insurance. And you're not really seeing a return on investment for that. But the one time you need it, it was worth all those years that you paid it. And so I kind of look at OEM certification as the same way. You may pay this money and you may not fix an Audi, or you may not fix a Honda, or you may not fix an Infiniti, but the one day one of those cars comes in and you know that you fixed it properly, that you didn't guess at the repair. I just think there's a ton of value in that. So in some ways it's almost like buying insurance because you know that you're doing that. You're making sure you're protecting yourself from any liability of doing an improper repair. But I also think there's something to be able to sleep at night knowing that you did a good repair because you followed the OEM procedures.
Great points. Thank you, Mike.
So we've discussed a little bit of the cost considerations and some of the equipment that MSOs need to think about, but above and beyond this, what other requirements will shops have to meet?
Just another couple of considerations to keep in mind. There are some OEs that require a specific brand of paint. Some may recommend certain or provide a list of acceptable brands. And also there may be some parts purchase requirements. For example, we saw some programs that require OE parts usage as much as 85%, and in some specific situations such as lease cars and things like that, they may require 100% OEM parts usage. So as you contemplate engaging in an OEM certification program, keep that in mind. Sometimes that can be a bit challenging in interacting with the insurance companies who may be looking for you to use some alternative parts as well.
Yeah, and Darrell, one thing I'll point out to that is, and this is not to bring up a controversial subject, but for example, there's one particular OEM certification program, and I won't particularly say their name right now, but they require that you buy all your parts through OE Connect. But if you're a State Farm Select Service first shop that's using Parts Trader, you're required to purchase all your parts through Parts Trader. So now you're kind of at a crossroads. Okay, if I want to retain my OEM certification, I have to buy all my parts through Connect. But if I want to be a State Farm Select Service, I got to buy them through Parts Trader. And that's not to pick on State Farm or Parts Trader, because it could be ABC Insurance Company, and they might have their own parts requisitioning system. So you're kind of trying to serve two masters. So I think if you're going to pursue some of these OEs, especially with all what we see, the change in the industry with parts requisitioning and parts procurement, it's really important that you find out from that insurer, hey, in order for me to comply with this, this is how I have to purchase my parts. How is this going to affect you? And you may want to ask that OEM the same thing, because I think that we're going to see a lot of crossroads with that in regards to parts procurement.
I think those are great points, and a lot of what we're trying to say is take all these things into consideration. Do your homework, ask questions, check with your insurance partners or DRP relationships so that you know what you're getting into before you sign on the dotted line, so to speak.
You mentioned asking questions and kind of really looking into this. There is a lot in the fine print that MSOs might not realize they need to commit to. Can you highlight what some of these key things might be?
Absolutely. And here again, no need for me to read all these. You can see them. But it gets into some pretty tedious things that you may not realize. I hate to say tedious, but some items that are things that you might not have expected, even in terms of the construction of your building, the layout, the parking lot, lighting standards, even things like name tags on staff. There's some very specific requirements from some of the OEs that need to be understood before you engage in a program.
Yeah, and I think that something else to throw out there is I know there are 2 OEM certification programs right now that also require you that you have to report any vehicles that you repair through the certification program. You actually have to submit something to Carfax, and that's something you have to agree to. So you have to make sure that you're okay with your business values or your business mission statement and who the customer is, et cetera, that if you're an OEM certified shop for 1 or 2 specific carriers, or not carriers, I'm sorry, but OEMs, you're going to have to go to Carfax and file that. I know some shops have an issue with that. Another thing is that I can tell you with, for example, like Audi, when you have a vehicle come in, you actually have to go, and there's some stuff online you have to go through, and you have to fill it out that you have the car there, what the VIN number is, et cetera, when it was picked up. And you have to kind of do updates through that. So it may require a little bit of additional input or data entry on behalf of your administrative staff. So I think you need to think about that. And the other thing I would put out there, too, that I've seen is there are some equipment manufacturers out there, or I should say distributors of equipment, that will tell you, hey, if you buy this from me, this type of frame machine or welder, this is approved by this specific OEM. One of the things you have to be cautious about is some of the vehicle manufacturers' certification programs, yes, they may recognize that specific welder, but you may have to buy that welder through their vendor program to make sure that it has the proper computer software in there, especially for some of these smart welders. So you can't just assume that you're buying an ABC welder or an ABC frame machine and that you're going to be compliant with that OEM, because it may have to go through a certain purchasing requisition just to make sure you have the right computer software loaded in there, whether it's a computerized measuring system or a spot welder.
What about in terms of inspections and auditing? How are OEM certification requirements different from what shops might be currently doing today?
We alluded to earlier, some may utilize an outside company. Some handle it themselves, but others may use companies such as Axalta, Assured Performance Network, or Verifax. And each has got their own little different spin on it. So here again, you want to do the research on it before you engage in a program so you understand the expectations that you'll be required to live up to. Some of these inspections get pretty extensive. Mike, can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I will tell you that in regards to like Chrysler program, that was probably one when I was actually involved in one of these recently, where there was somebody getting approved for that program. I was actually very impressed with the details that the Chrysler was utilizing to have someone go in there and ensure that they had the proper equipment, it was functional and actually owned by that shop. I can also tell you again that Audi and Porsche, Nissan Infiniti, they're using, again, Axalta Coatings, formerly known as DuPont, to do their certifications. And again, they actually have what is called their business development managers that go on site. And again, they're actually recording the serial numbers off the welders or off the frame machines. They're making sure that your ICAR classes, if you have to have those, are approved, and they're holding a very stiff line on that. So I think it's something that if you think you can kind of slide by with it, I don't think there's going to be as much leeway, because I think the OEMs take a lot of pride in their network, and they really are trying to raise the bar of the industry through these programs.
I agree, Mike. I've been involved in situations before where going through the certification process and inspectors come in that I may end up spending 2, 3, even 4 hours with like I said, inspecting all the equipment in the shop, logging serial numbers, model numbers, making sure it's in compliance, and then following up with further meetings. And sometimes they will give you some leeway on it. You might have a piece of equipment that might be comparable that they might be willing to accept. In other cases, there's not much flexibility.
Correct. Totally agree, Darrell.
Darrell, you mentioned, I believe, briefly about the Assured Performance Network. That is an option that allows shops to gain certifications for multiple OEMs through one program. Can you tell us a little bit more about this option?
Yeah, from my understanding of this, Assured Performance offers a certification program for all sorts of manufacturers, but some have been accepted by some specific manufacturers, such as we alluded to Chrysler before. So in other words, if you want a Chrysler certification, you're going to end up going through Assured Performance Network. And they also offer some additional enhancements to the program, such as rebate awards and some marketing opportunities and things like that.
For all the dollars and time that need to be put in by an MSO in order to gain an OEM certification, what can they count on to get in return for their investment?
You know, Mike alluded to it before, that return on investment, and certainly that's an important consideration as well as the long-term impact on your business in terms of positioning yourself. But some of the immediate things that can sort of pay you back, so to speak, obviously the most significant one are those referrals that come directly from the dealership. But also keep in mind the OE might offer referrals that might come through their website. Some are doing some advertising. Personally, in my opinion, as the manufacturers engage more and more certifications, and as they promote it more, the value of certifications is going to continue to go up, because as the public gains perception that there is value in them seeking out a certified shop, they're going to wind up there more often. In other words, you're going to see more of that type of work if you're certified. And frankly, some of those that are not certified might be left out in the cold, so to speak. But also keep in mind all the other marketing opportunities you have through this too, where you can, on your own literature, indicate that you're certified by these various manufacturers. And sometimes there's some additional technical information and training that might come through the manufacturer that other shops might not be able to obtain.
Yeah, and Darrell, a couple of things I would just kind of piggyback on that is, again, you know, it's like any good marketing strategy, you know, there's a lot of opportunity out there. A lot of the OEMs provide marketing literature, use of their logo, but it's really about leveraging that. You know, it's going to be there, but you're really going to get out of it what you put into it. The one word of caution I would give everyone, though, is I recently was working with an MSO that actually went to acquire somebody that had several OEM certifications. And that MSO, when they went to actually purchase this other location that had several OEM certifications, one of the things I told them was, I said, look, you need to make sure that those OEM certifications will transfer, because it's much like a DRP. When you buy a business or it changes ownership or it changes hands, there's not necessarily that DRP or that OEM certification will transfer. And unfortunately, out of the 3 OEM certifications that this shop had, 2 of them transferred over to the new owner, but one of them, which was one of the German manufacturers, did not. And that was the biggest reason this person actually wanted to purchase this, was for that one German OEM certification. But what happened was there was a dealership in that area that was owned by one of the big mega dealers, and they had been really just kind of pressing this one OEM to make them a certified shop. And once the door opened for a change in ownership, it gave that OEM an out to be able to provide it to this other mega dealer who's obviously selling a lot of their brands at the dealership. And so that OEM dealer certification did not transfer over with the acquisition. So make sure if you're going to purchase an additional location and you're purchasing that for that purpose of OEM certifications, make sure you get something in writing from that OEM that says it's actually going to transfer over.
Great points. Thank you.
In terms of a relationship with dealerships, OEM certifications can really help to bolster these for the MSOs. What are some of the elements to be considered and discussed to ensure the best outcome for both the MSO and the dealership?
Well, Krista, a lot of people perceive the dealership relationship as just a necessity, and that the dealership's role is just to refer work to them. But frankly, there's a whole lot of other opportunities there if you wanted to form a more formal relationship, a closer, more intimate relationship. There are things that you can work out with them. Perhaps as part of the negotiation, you may negotiate a certain price discount. You might advertise each other. I know, just as an example, at LaMettry's, we're going to be putting on some senior driving classes, and we're partnering up with a partner dealership on that, and both working together on it at the same time, promote both businesses at the same time. You can also utilize each other's glass services, PDR services. some shops engage in such a formal relationship at a dealership that we might even put an estimator there at the dealership, perhaps even full-time, so that when vehicles come into the service aisle or are towed in, there's a person on site that can write estimates, can answer questions on body and paint issues, and orchestrate the transportation of cars back and forth from the repair shop. So really it's up to you to how extensive you want to take that dealership relationship, but there's an immense amount of opportunities there that can really benefit both parties.
Yes, and I mean, I've even known some OEMs or dealerships, I should say, that they're willing to kind of co-brand with some of their marketing lists to their cars that they're sold. So maybe, for example, the body shop may have a chance to actually do new car clinics for some of the new car purchases. I know of one person that actually, they had a great relationship. They were OEM certified with a specific brand in a dealership, and they automatically programmed the name of their shop into the GPSs on any cars that were being sold. So again, there were some great marketing opportunities there and to build a relationship and leverage that. But again, there are shops out there that, again, are real aggressive and real assertive with that. Some are not. The one thing that you do not have to be too assertive with that will come to you kind of naturally is also being able to do any of that OEM's leasing vehicles. Generally, they're going to try to take most OEM certification programs. If that OEM has a leasing program in that local area, they're generally going to try to send you those work. Much like a DRP, sometimes they want to have a pricing menu, or they may look for a parts discount, or may require you use all OEM parts or have caps on this or that. So again, but it can lead to some work through their leasing programs as well.
You've both discussed a lot of the key benefits for MSOs when engaging in these certifications. What are some of the secondary benefits that could be overlooked initially?
Mr. Moore, these are unique to an MSO where you can utilize your size to get some additional benefits from that OEM certification. For example, as it's listed here, feeding the OEM certified shop. In other words, oftentimes you're required to just have one shop, for example, as the certified shop. So you might load level cars from your other shops to that site. And of course, if you're larger, it gives you much more bargaining power to negotiate your equipment purchases, your parts discounts, and all sorts of other things. Another nice advantage is that oftentimes you're privy to some technical information and perhaps some new equipment that the dealership or OE might share with you before it's shared with the rest of the market. And obviously, as an MSO, you can share that with your other shops as well and get a kind of a leg up on the competition, so to speak.
Yeah, I think also, Darrell, that too, if you have multiple locations that can feed into that certified OEM shop, especially if it's one of the higher-end programs that costs a lot to get involved in, like Audi or Mercedes, that it's also a little bit easier to justify maybe investing the money into the equipment, especially from the equipment investment side, because you might have multiple locations that are actually feeding that. So I think there can definitely be some leverages there. I will also tell you that I've seen in regards to some of the like there's one particular OEM, to be a certified facility, you actually have to use their factory paint. And their factory paint, when I first heard of that program, I was like, oh my gosh, that might just dip into my my gross profit on my paint materials, and because you have to buy your allied products and your liquid through the specific OEM's parts department. But I actually saw that some of the discounts on that were probably even better than what the shop was actually getting from their local jobber or their local paint distributor. Obviously, you need to be concerned with support because the support needs to come from someone. So again, there's some pluses and minuses there.
And what about market trends? How can some of the trends in the market today factor into this decision?
I think it's a pretty safe bet that there's going to be an increased prevalence of OE certifications. We keep hearing about those that are being developed. More and more happen now that didn't. We've had them around for some years, but some haven't panned out in the past, but they seem to be gaining momentum. And so we keep hearing more, and I think that trend is going to continue, especially as the technology changes in cars and cars become more and more sophisticated. It almost becomes a necessity to stay ahead of the technology and make sure that we're offering the kind of quality repairs that the OEMs need us to provide to make the car behave as it did before in another collision.
Yeah, and Darrell, I would also echo that because I believe that we're going to see a lot more electronic types of things that we're going to have to itemize on an estimate, things like zero-point calibration, with the accident avoidance systems, the occupant classification systems, and these are mandatory that they get reset or reprogrammed when vehicles are in an accident. And I can tell you, as I travel the country over 300 days a year doing seminars, it appears that the masses are unaware of a lot of these things that are required to fix a car properly. I think by getting involved in the OEM programs, it might shorten that learning curve, and we might be able to get that information out to the field, out to our technicians, and dispensed further. But I think, again, whether you're an independent or you're an MSO, you've got a way to be able to get that whoever that point of contact is that receives these updates from the OEMs or says this is what you need to do, we have to find a way to disperse that to the rest of our staff, whether it's our technicians or our estimators, because, again, the information is no good if we just hold it to ourselves. So I think, again, with all the advances in technology, accident avoidance systems, new metals being used, we look at like Honda and Acura recently that stated that they're going to be using aluminum door skins that bond to steel door frames, and then you look at the Ford F-150 with a lot of the exterior panels on that, they're aluminum now. I think we definitely are going to have to way to be able to convey that information. And while iCar is great, and I think that they do provide a great value to our industry, I think that even the OEMs sometimes kind of hold that information back a little bit. But if you're kind of on the inner circle, I think we're going to be able to fix cars a lot quicker because we'll have access to their information, but also we'll be able to fix them properly.
Mike, do you remember when DRPs were coming into prevalence in the 80s and 90s when it was easier to get one and eventually got to the point where the marketplace is more or less saturated, where there aren't as many available? Do you think we're going to see the same sort of thing with OEM certification? So is that some logic that a shop operator may want to use right now to get on board early, so to speak?
Yes, absolutely, Darrell. I would agree with that. Having sat in on some of the OEM discussions with some of the certified shops, one of the biggest things that shops say is, look, if I go there and invest this amount of money in equipment and training, I want to have something that's going to kind of protect my market. I don't want to have it where there's one on every corner because that doesn't, it doesn't benefit me. So they're looking for the OEMs to kind of protect them a little bit in regards to how many shops they will allow in a certain area. So I think the shops that step up first, that are willing to invest the money and willing to make the investment in training and equipment and maybe even, cosmetic appearances on their facility, I think that they are going to leverage against the OEMs to say, hey, I really need you to protect my investment here and not make so there's too many players. So I would absolutely unequivocally agree with that, Darrell.
How about exclusivity? We saw earlier that Chrysler was talking about getting up to 1,500 shops to really get the substance that they're looking for. I think, would you agree that a lot of the other OEs are looking to restrict it a lot more and have far fewer shops?
Absolutely. I totally agree. I mean, if you look at the dealership network, I think you would agree with that. I mean, if you look at Toyota and Lexus, they would, they didn't have to close any dealerships down when the big recession hit us recently. It's because they always controlled the amount of dealerships that would be, in the U.S. versus if you look at like GM, Ford, and Chrysler, they just kind of flooded the market. And anybody that wanted a dealership, if they anteed up and met a few basic requirements, they could have a dealership. And then you saw that GM and Chrysler had to close a lot of dealerships when times got tough. So I think the OEMs learned a lesson from that. And just as they don't want to saturate the market with too many dealerships, I think they're not going to want to saturate the market with body shops. So I think that if we look at history can teach us a lesson just from the dealership standpoint that would apply to OEM certifications for collision repair shops.
Great points. Thank you.
As Darrell mentioned earlier, Mike has facilitated some successful OEM certifications in his own shop. Let's talk a little bit about, Mike, what you had to say about OEM certifications.
Well, again, I think as everybody they could see my comments there, I'll just kind of really just paraphrase by using the first sentence, and that is that it's really my opinion that for shops in the future to thrive and not just survive, that they're going to have to give much more consideration to OEM training and tooling and equipment. And I think in the past, everybody just kind of felt that, I don't really need to be worried about OEM certification because I'm not going to fix Audis or Mercedes. Well, I think that kind of probably held true 10 years ago, but I think today when we look at Honda and Acura using a lot more aluminum, we see carbon fiber coming out with like the Nissan GTR that's carbon fiber and aluminum. And then you have the Ford F-150 that's aluminum, and they're talking about using on the Mustang. So I think that you can't just kind of just sit off in your little corner and say, you know what, I'm not going to do German cars. This doesn't apply to me. I think if you're going to fix cars or trucks, period, whether it be a domestic or an Asian vehicle or a European vehicle, that you are going to have to be very cutting edge. One of the things that concerns me is I do seminars, again, all across the country. I did a seminar yesterday for 60-some people in Fairfield, California, and I recently did a seminar for over 100 people in Arizona. And I asked everybody in the room, how many of you have a nail gun or a stud gun that you could use to weld pins to pull a dent out of a steel door? Everybody raised their hands. I said, how many of you have those for aluminum? And I'm lucky if maybe one or two people in an audience of 100 even raise their hands. And my question is, how are all of you fixing these cars that when they come in that have aluminum panels? The Cadillac has some aluminum panels on it. So, and again, this isn't about aluminum repairs. This is about OEM certification. But my concern is that for people in the future to be fixing cars properly, we really need to start looking at the amount of money that we're going to invest in equipment. I think that spot welders in some cases, they become like computers, that with the federal government really pushing the automobile manufacturers to make vehicles that are safer, they get better fuel economy. I think the push to use alternative metals or alternative substrates like carbon fiber or magnesium or aluminum is going to really, I don't even think we've tapped into that yet. And I think, unfortunately, spout welders and some other equipment are going to become like computers and that they'll be obsolete after 2 or 3 years. So I think that we really need to be looking at the equipment investments when we're building our budgets and doing our pro formas, whether it's for an acquisition. You might go to buy a business, and that business may have to have their spot welder updated. They may have to have, spray equipment updated, their frame machine updated, depending on what your niche or market you're going for is. So I think that what we're using for pro formas and budgets for acquisitions, I think absolutely we need to take into consideration the cost we may have to do to bring the entire staff up to iCard level or invest in equipment. So I think it's going to be a huge thing for us in the future.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Now, Darrell and Mike, you've really provided a lot of information and given us a lot to consider. Can you summarize and just, hit again on what are the real key points that MSOs need to keep in mind?
Obviously, the cost, the return on investment are key considerations and have to be carefully contemplated. I like a few of the statements further down on that list, though. Don't let ego obscure good logic. It's awful easy for us, especially as MSOs, to sometimes get the ego in front of us and make decisions based on that instead of good logic. And I really like the phrase at the bottom that it is generally accepted and not illegal for a dealership or OEM to steer customers to a specific shop. I think, we talk in our industry an awful lot about steering, but frankly, this is a scenario where it is acceptable, where dealerships and OEs can refer work and steer work to shops, and frankly, it can be an advantage to both, and hence another reason to get on board on programs when they do make sense for you, obviously. Mike, have you got anything to add to that in conclusion?
Yeah, Darrell, I just want to really just reiterate one point you said, and that was don't let your ego obscure good logic. Make sure that pride's not involved. A lot of people just want bragging rights to say, hey, I'm Porsche certified, I'm Audi certified, I'm Mercedes certified. That's the wrong reason to want to become OEM certified. Make sure that you've got enough cars in your area that are being sold. You have enough vehicles of that specific type in your market area to support whatever you're going to invest into that. But again, I would just reiterate that tenfold. Don't let pride be your motivator for wanting to become OEM certified. Just have bragging rights. Only do it if it makes sense.
Okay, we'd like to take this opportunity now to solicit some questions from our viewers. If you have a question to ask, simply type it up in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and you can send it to us through the channel provided. So to kick us off, Darrell and Mike, does OEM certification add to the cost of repair, and could that put you in a negative light among insurers?
Yeah, it does. Obviously, the equipment costs, the education costs, and obviously it needs to be taken into consideration, and any business needs to work. In other words, the cold hard truth is we need to be able to show a profit to sustain ourselves. So yes, it is up to us to find a way to make it work. Now does that mean you necessarily can increase rates or have to? It may or may not, but something, again, to take into consideration. But obviously, in the bigger picture, you need to look at the business model because there are going to be increased costs to making an OE certification work.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that, Darrell. I really believe that I don't care what type of vehicle it is, whether it's a domestic vehicle, an Asian vehicle, or a European vehicle. I think just with the way they're making vehicles today more complex, the amount of computers are in there, and again, the amount of electronics that have to be reset or reprogrammed or recalibrated due to accident avoidance systems, that the cost of repairs is going to escalate. And I don't think there's anything a shop or it's only a matter of cutting a paint time or saying I'm not going to pay for an not-included operation. I think that you're going to see a lot of things that are going to be mandatory. And I do think that it's going to put, if you're heavily into a DRP, there may be some things that the OEM is going to require that you do on that vehicle that you're going to have to make some strong business decisions on. And I think a lot of people, when they first think about that, they're thinking about OEM parts usage versus aftermarket. But I think it's going to be, the amount of time that you spend doing an alignment, because there's certain procedures that have to be done versus just taking it to a tire shop that's doing it for $69.95. So I do believe there may be some challenges. I think in the past, a lot of people that had the higher-end OEM certifications, and I'm not saying this was always the case, I'm just saying it's been my experience that most people that had those high-end OEM certifications typically were not DRPs or they were very limited on DRPs. But I think we're seeing that change because now just, again, domestic or Asian vehicles, like I said, whether it's a Ford truck or a Chrysler or a Honda, there's their certification programs. But again, they still may have requirements in regards to your investment into iCar and maintaining a certain amount of training or having to use factory-only parts in order to repair their vehicles. So I do think there'll be some decisions and discussions to be made, which will create for some exciting times in the future.
Mike, do you think the OE certifications are going to drive some of these pricing issues? So in other words, as the OEs specify specific repair procedures that they feel are necessary in the proper repair of the car, it's going to highlight that particular issue and thus drive us to find a way to be compensated for it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you an example. I will tell you an insurer recently, and I'll just kind of leave it to tell you that they're in the top 5. They called me actually last week, and they said, Mike, we have this vehicle. It's a specific type of vehicle, and it's getting repaired at a shop that's in Texas, and they said the shop has on this estimate, because it's a kind of specialty type of vehicle, to set up and perform test welds. Is that really necessary? And the shop's trying to charge us for that. And my comment to them was, yes, it is necessary. It absolutely is. I had another shop recently that called me, and they were actually fixing a vehicle. On the specific vehicle, it was actually a Porsche, and the shop had to remove the bumper, and because it had parking sensors in there, they had to be recalibrated. And they're like, well, all we did was order out the bumper for paint. Why should we have to pay for that? And then the next comment that the insurer said was, well, next time I'm not going to pay to order out the bumper. They're just going to have to loosen it to work around it. So I do think that some of the things we typically get paid for today, like the R&I for paint, because of some of the added features that may be required by the OEM to properly fix that vehicle, we may see some insurer pressures that say, hey, can you just loosen that, or can you tape it up versus taking it off? And I'm not saying it's right, wrong, or indifferent. I'm just kind of stating some factual examples I've experienced recently.
Great, thank you. Going on to the next one. If you have a business relationship with a local dealer and they refer work to your shop already, do you still think it's worth being an OEM certified shop, for ROI considerations?
I'd like to kind of jump in there on that, Darrell. I think at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, do I want to fix the car properly? And I think that's really what you have to ask yourself. Do I want to fix the car properly? And I think that's really going to have to be, depending on what your values and your ethics are and your mission statement of your business, if you want to fix the car properly and it requires being certified or using a specific welder or a certain type of adhesive or rivet, then I think that's what you just have to ask yourself. And I think most smart business owners are going to say, yes, I do want to fix the car properly. And I think we're coming to a crossroads in our industry where a lot of times people can say, well, I'm not paying for that, nobody else charges me for that, et cetera. But at some point, we almost have to look at the liability on it. Almost like we looked at hazmat when it first came onto the scene, It was something that people said, what, we're going to have to pay something on this. It's just the way life is. And I think that we're going to have a lot of these types of discussions here in the future.
I think you made great points, Mike, and I'll throw an alternative viewpoint on that. I was involved at one point with interacting with a dealership where they were referring work already, and I signed up for the certification program, spent a lot of money on it, got certified, and frankly the volume didn't go up, and later this dealership was part of a dealership group that decided they wanted to be in the collision business, and so they opened up their own shops and left me out in the cold. And so in that case, obviously, it wasn't worth doing, but that's just another one of those risks you need to take into consideration. But I completely agree long-term in the benefits of the certification.
Yeah, and again, Darrell, great point there. Again, I think if it's a local dealership that is referring you work, you're probably a little bit more secure in that than if you're dealing with one of the big mega dealerships. Because if we look at the dealership and body shop relationship, we actually had a decline for probably the past 5 or 6 years where dealerships actually had less and less body shops. But in 2012 and the first quarter of 2003, we've actually seen a spike of almost a 5% increase of dealerships actually having their own body shops. So when we look at growth in our industry, next to MSOs, we actually see growth on the dealership side. So if you are relying on a lot of work from a dealership, especially if it's one of the mega dealerships that's a conglomerate or a chain, I think that you'd have to be a little bit cautious and not get too comfortable there, because you could lose that if they start looking at the part sales and say, hey, you know what, we're not looking at the body shop as the red-headed stepchild anymore. This is a profit center for us, and it makes sense for us to have a shop. So, again, if you're in a rural area, you're doing work for a dealership that's just kind of family-owned or something, then you're probably going to be a little bit secure in that. But I think it's a very valid point you bring, Darrell.
It might be something to take into consideration when you enter into a relationship like that. Perhaps there's some way to get some kind of a guarantee or for a certain time period. Just a thought.
Very, very true.
Speaking of time periods, how long does the average certification last before you need to recertify?
Mike, wouldn't they typically be 1 to 2 years?
That is correct, yes. So again, sometimes it's ongoing training, almost like ICAR, where you just have to have so much, continuing education on a yearly basis or every other year. And some is you actually have to be recertified just because on the new makes and models or repair procedures are coming out. But typically we're seeing that to be about every 2 years.
And, you mentioned ICAR. It's interesting that ICAR and ICAR Gold Class are being required by more and more OEMs and, not just driven by DRP programs anymore. Any thoughts on this?
Well, I think for some of the OEMs, it makes sense for them to have their own training center from a cost standpoint. You look at, Porsche, Audi, and Volkswagen, they're kind of like, kind of sister companies. So they recently moved their training facility where all their training was done at the Appleton iCar Training Center, and they actually opened up their own facility in Herndon, Virginia, and they just, got some trainers in there, et cetera. But again, that's because you got a lot of sister brands kind of, they're cohesive there. Again, if you look at Chrysler or GM, I still think there's a role, and they'll continue to do their training through iCar just because it makes sense for them going out and having to purchase a training center and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it just really depends on the brands that are kind of intermingled there. I think that's really what's going to dictate on the future.
Certainly is handy for shops that we can utilize iCar training for as much of this as we can because it can apply to other certifications as well, or just for our own iCar Gold certification, or standard, I should say.
That's correct. One of the things I'll also add is prior to my getting my employees certified through some of the OEM programs, one of the things that I did was I actually sent them to the Lincoln Basic Motorsport Welding School, which is sponsored by Lincoln Welding. And I would say it was probably one of the hands-down best training I ever sent any of my employees to. It is, again, it's by Lincoln welders. They have what's called the Basic Motorsport Welding Program, and it really teaches you the theory about how to weld aluminum versus most body technicians are kind of self-taught. And their student-to-teacher ratio is only like 13 students to every one instructor. And it was about $535 for 4 days of training, which was about 60 to 70% hands-on and only 20 to 30% classroom. And I found by sending my technicians to that, it really helped them to do a lot better when they went to some of the OEM certifications in regards to their performance of welding.
Okay. What are some, I know during the presentation you mentioned paint and some welders. What are some of the other materials that are required by OEMs for their certification?
I think some of those are, a lot of times you see a lot of shops that have, they have a lot of hardware containers, be it from, Worth or Windsor or Ken Industries or some of the other companies, and they stock a lot of clips and rivets. I think it depends on some of the OEM certification programs you're dealing with. You'll find out that a lot of those products are not available, especially on the aluminum side, to be stocked in inventory just because the crashworthiness of like specific rivets or some of the panel bonding adhesives that are required. It's not something you're going to be able to just buy from like a third party and you kind of have a generic or aftermarket clip or rivet or hardware bolt. I think that you'll start to see a lot more OEM clips and fasteners used that you'll have to purchase through the dealership. And that's going to go back to, again, the importance of doing 100% disassembly and an accurate estimate on the beginning, because right now if somebody doesn't do that, they've always kind of got that like that first aid kit. They can go and pull a handful of clips out of a rivet. But when you get into some of these OEM certification programs and what they require, if you don't do 100% teardown, it could mean a day between a day of cycle time loss or 3 to 4 days if you have to order that clip or rivet because it has to be OEM specific approved.
Kind of piggybacking on this, if you have the approved equipment such as a welder, can this be shared between different shops and can you still maintain the certification?
My experience has been that that welder is assigned to that facility and it cannot be shared. That's not to say that it can't, because there could be some that you're approved and I'm not aware of, but typically it's that specific facility with that specific, whether it's a tax ID number or EPA number, or if a specific address that's assigned to that facility, that's the facility that is certified, because most of the OEM manufacturers are going to take and list that specific facility on their website. If you look at like a Honda's website or Nissan, Infiniti, or Audi, bottom line is they have a specific address where that equipment resides, and that's where it's done at, especially when you're talking like specific frame machines or jigs and things of that nature as well.
I think for the most part you got to be accurate with that, Mike, although I can think of one exception when I had an OE certification where I had a specific measuring system in another shop, and they did allow me a variance on that with a guarantee that jobs of a certain size would be shipped over to that shop for the pulling and measuring and then brought back to that first shop. And again, maybe that's a rare exception, but that's something, again, that you'd want to check into before you finalize your certification plan.
Yeah, very good point. Also, I can also tell you that some of the things I see that in regards to shops that invest a lot into OEM certifications having difficulty getting reimbursed for, just because that kind of falls into all this is, for example, if you're in an OEM that requires the use of jig fixtures, a lot of insurance companies don't want to pay to rent those jigs if you have to rent them. So sometimes that can be, a negative item for you that you can't collect for. I know that some shops that do, for example, aluminum BMWs that are certified or have certified or factory trained technicians, there's a specific cure time on that BMW adhesive when it's panel bonded. And I've seen some shops say, well, hey, this car has to sit in the stall for 24 to 36 hours, and they want to charge stall cure time. And then what happens is that becomes a conflict with an insurer that may say they will or will not pay for it. So again, there are some things that come along there that are going to be kind of specific to that vehicle to repair it according to OEM specs that may cause some, again, conflicts in regards to what you're charging. And I don't even want to say a conflict. I think that there's going to be, as shops become more educated through OEM certification programs, there may have to be some higher level discussions between the decision maker from the shop and the decision maker from the insurance company that says, hey, let's just sit down and have kind of an awareness discussion. Let me tell you about some of the things we're required to do, and here's why we need to do it, because it has to do with safety or liability, whatever the case may be. And instead of just sending an appraiser out to the local level and saying, okay, I need you to start charging for this on every job, I think we might have to have some kind of higher level discussions just to kind of make awareness on all sides of on the avenue.
Thank you. Okay, our last question today. Do you think in the future the insurance companies will be directing work more to OEM certified shops than non-OEM certified shops?
Well, that's going to be natural, because those that are going to position themselves for success in the future are going to have to embrace new technologies and equipment training, that sort of thing. And it just kind of falls in line with OE certification. So to some extent, it's going to happen naturally. And there's a good chance that if the OEs do enough marketing on the value of sending jobs to a certified shop, in other words, so that the customer perceives that it is important that their car goes to a certified shop, that will put a lot of pressure on the insurers as well to work with those shops that are certified.
Like I said, that's all the time we have for questions today. I'm sorry if we were unable to address your specific question, but thank you to Darrell and Mike for sharing your insights and your time, and also thanks to all of you who joined us for the webcast. If you'd like to view it again or share it with someone who is unable to participate, it will soon be archived at abrn.com/MSOOEM. Again, that's www.abrn.com/MSOOEM. We'd also, again, like to offer a special thanks to our event sponsor, PPG, for their support in putting on this webinar. Thank you so much to all of our attendees and especially to our speakers, again, Darrell Amberson and Mike Anderson. Have a great afternoon.